Hello and welcome back to Bite Size Crook Roar. If you're joining me for the first time, please click on the link below to see the introduction. Otherwise, I'm going to launch right into this. Today we're doing Either Or Part 2. You may have noticed I got a new camera set up and it's doing some eye tracking, so hopefully you can read this. There we go, yes. So this is Part 2, and remember these two books are like kind of like dueling pistols of life views. This book is very much this is author B, and this is very much representing the ethical lifestyle, the life of the married man, contrasting it with the author of the first part, the infamous Seducer's Diary, and so forth. These collection of papers. Author A, who is more a fan of the aesthetic lifestyle, and obsessed with the first love and so forth. But we'll get right into that after we do the bookmark of the video. So this one is a little National Geographic hologram, not showing up too. There we go. Here, pretty cool. I don't think it's captured that great, but you get the idea. Apparently, 1988 National Geographic Society. So interesting. Got a little. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Let's get that over with. I'm gonna set the book aside too. I think I might quote from it, but I'm gonna launch right into this. It's gonna be a bit longer video. I apologize, but I found this book actually more interesting to my surprise. Maybe it's because I've matured, but I've appreciated it a lot more than I did the first time I read it, and I think it's in a sense better than the first book. The first book is that's great to hear about Don Giovanni, and he's getting so much excitement about it, and the Seducer's Diary is juicy and everything. But this book is really about, okay, well, that time in your life is temporary. Let's settle down now, and this is what life is going to be about. This is how married life is, and I think it's a great thing, and I think it's great that there's the aesthetic in your life, but I think it's better represented, and there is the aesthetic in the ethical life too. It's just that it's kind of dethroned, he says, and transformed into something a little more beautiful. So I think he made a pretty convincing case for that. But we see these contrasts. So, there's a lot of these contrasts between author A, the author of the first part, and author B, the author of the second part. And they're really contrasting life views. But he's really saying, so this is really author B's critique of author A's life direction. He's really saying your life is a life of possibilities everywhere, and that's great. Page 226. You're experimenting, but really, when it comes down to it, your life is about inaction. My life, in contrast, the ethical life, is about action. About there's tasks everywhere, not possibilities everywhere. Page 226. And you must make your choice in time, page 149. That's great that you have an experimenting love, page 90. Maybe you have a little bit of history to that love, but there's no continuity to it. You don't really have a past to that relationship, because your relationships only survive for maybe 6 months or so, and you're not looking forward to the future because you're cutting it off right before the seducer especially is cutting off and not really going any farther. They're staying in the realm of the first love and not progressing into marriage, right? In contrast, B says, I have a historical continuity in my life, where I have this duty, and what gives it part of the continuity is this duty is this future tense, this one on page 135, that puts it into the realm of the future, right? So A is very much living in the moment, and especially in modern society we say you should live in the moment and all this, and that's great that you appreciate the moment. Author B is saying, not only do I have the moment, but I have this continuity with the past of that relationship and the future. And I think a great illustration of that was, he said, in a marriage there's children, and children are kind of a representation of the past and the future. If you think about it, it's kind of like reliving your childhood when you have your kids. That's kind of like the past, the nostalgia aspect. And then the future, of course, the kids are going to outlive you probably, right? And then continue on, after you. So they're looking towards the future at the same time. Beautiful imagery. And he's saying, okay, your life is like a turbulent sea in page 130, but my life is more like a quiet, deep water. It has more more of this purpose, like and I think it starts in the second part on page 161 here, but it says, my either or, coming to the title of the book, my either or is about choosing and not choosing, or action and inaction. And there is a little bit of the tongue in cheek that not choosing is kind of a choice in itself, but we'll put that aside for a little bit. But yeah, A is lacking this metamorphosis on page 201, the metamorphosis that transforms the aesthetic life into the ethical life. He's almost, because it's lacking like that, he's almost not a person. He's like a plant, he says on page 202. He lacks a life view. And that's the original Hans Christian Andersen criticism from a few books back, if you remember. In contrast, B says, I have an awareness of good and evil. 202, I have a life view. And in my world, the aesthetic is dethroned. It's controlled. It's transfigured. But the aesthetic is still there in the ethical. So what happens? I still get to enjoy it, but it's something that's more beautiful because it's been transformed. He's saying all aestheticians have a secret horror of despairing on page 204. Their life is about accidental moods, pursuing possibilities. Rather, B is like a master of these moods, page 206. I'll just let me skip forward a little bit. The A's life is about the accidental, the demon of arbitrariness. But I have mastered these, I've turned these accidental qualities, I've chosen them, and I've ennobled them by choosing them, page 235. Again, first love versus the marriage life, right? And it's about preserving, preserving the love. Love can still be preserved in the marriage life, and contrasting these two, like romantic love, or that first love that A is obsessed with. Sure, you can portray that artistically way better than the religious life, the marital love. But that doesn't mean it's more aesthetic. In fact, B says, I think the marital love is more aesthetic. It doesn't matter that it can't be portrayed as well. That has nothing to do. It's actually more beautiful, and it must become historical. He said again, page 108. A thinks maybe duty is like the enemy of love. Resisting that. Page 133. In contrast, B is saying, no, duty is the friend of love. And again, like A is maybe saying on page 133, the aesthetic, the ethical, the religious, they're all at odds, and B is saying, no, they're actually allies. I love this imagery on page 185 of also giving birth to yourself. A is holding off giving birth to himself on page 185. Rather, B is choosing his authentic self, gaining oneself, giving birth to oneself, page 232. He has an awareness of his eternal being, the self as the task, page 230. Choosing self infinitely, page 200. Has a self-consciousness. All these things that A is lacking, really. Also, an idea that A is depending too much on the external, and because of that, despairing, page 211. But rather, there's a duty, and it's an internal duty, in page 228. Again, the internal-external contrast is very Kierkegaardian. Some talk about boredom. Yeah, you can get bored of work, 260. I'll skip past this. But also some talk about, suffering is required. Suffering is required to become extraordinary, page 298, or to grow yourself. Suffering is required to know God and to find meaning. Finding God through pain and suffering, page 103. But there is a danger of too much suffering. If you suffer too much, you can become like a ghost in the world, he says at one point. And that's no good, right? And you're lacking coming back into the world. There's a very Kierkegaardian theme about a double movement, which I'll try to explain pretty simply. If you think about monks, monks don't do the double movement. They do a single movement. They give up on the world. They renounce the world. They have that resignation. That's the Kierkegaardian word for that. They give it up and give it to God. That's the one move, right? But what's the double movement then? The double movement is kind of going in reverse and saying, once I have resigned to the world, I'm actually going to go back into the world again, and still enjoy it and still experience it and still enjoy it with the with the tinge of that knowledge of that I have renounced it, still go back into it and experience it again. And that double movement in this context is marriage. It's like giving up on that idea of the first love and all that. Like, okay, that happened, but sort of like giving it to God, and but also coming, but not escaping from the world, because that's alienation, right? That what monks do, they live on a hilltop, right, apart from society. That's very alienating from society, right? And Kierkegaard doesn't mention this, but if you really think about, what are the greatest commandments? Love God and love your neighbor, right? The double movement is kind of reflected in that, right? You love God through the resignation of the world, and you're looking towards God, but then again you're still living in the world and you're experiencing it. Because if you just do that single movement, right, then why don't you just say, I'm going to kill myself and I'm going to go to heaven and everything will be hunky-dory, right? But know that you need that double movement to grow, to come back into the world and live with that knowledge. That's a difficult thing. It's not an easy thing. So we'll hear about this double movement in a different context later on, especially fear and trembling, much different context, but a similar concept that starts with a resignation to the world. And then an idea that the romantic love can be represented in art and sculpture and all this. That's great. It can be represented in that. But what's the best way to represent the marital love? It's being represented by being lived. 124. That is a very Kierkegaardian theme. That is the expression of love through the living of it. And then a kind of a callback to the unhappiest one. Turns out sorrow is a part of life. It's required for life. The unhappiest one actually is the one who has supreme happiness on page 208. And now I'm just going to go through. I've taken too many notes, but I've tried to narrow it down. So I'm going to pick out some highlights on things that jumped out at me. Page 14, existence in the world can't be based solely on the accidental, and that accidental is the life of author A, saying, no, you need a life view. You can't just spend it flitting around from first love to first love. It's got to be something more than that to give your world meaning. Page 33, erotic love is part of marriage's past, and it's still there, but there's an idea that there's also that double movement. Erotic love yields to like a resignation. It can't persist, right? Stereotypically, love is, that erotic love is very fleeting, right? And it turns into something different. That romantic love, but that comes with a double movement of its own, through resignation first, and then coming back into it, and then realizing there's marriage and there's a duty of marriage, and it transforms into something different. Page 86, I'm just going to quote this. Thus I believe it has become apparent that, insofar as one seeks the aesthetic in the first love in its present tense, marriage must be regarded as its transfiguration, and even more beautiful than first love. So saying that that sense of the first love that A is obsessed with so much, hey man, I've got it way better here. It's been transformed here, and it's preserved in this marriage. Page 87, contrasting scientific doubt versus personal doubt. And this is certainly Kierkegaardian and important in terms of Kierkegaard terms. And scientific, and you could also say philosophical in some context. In this page, he says scientific, but there's an idea that there's this is thinking about a scientific doubt to advance science, and also philosophic doubt is like the foundation, that Cartesian foundation, right? That's Descartes doubting everything that there is to doubt. But where can I find the foundation? It's because, well, I know that in order to doubt, I have to presuppose that, there's someone doing the doubting, right? That's the foundation of modern philosophy. By the way, even that has been contested. That's a whole other topic. But that's the foundation for the science and the philosophic doubt. But what's the personal doubt? What's the personal form of that? it's actually the psychological thing. It's actually a form of despair. It's like reaching rock bottom in a sense, and trying to find that foundation and try to, you find that through despair. And that is your foundation. You start building up from there. That is in a sense required. That suffering and that despair is required to start building up. That's what I was starting to get into. I was maybe reading a little bit into it, but that's what I was understanding out of this passage and the book as a whole. Some other sections, I think, give more of that view. Page 113, there is a danger of too much suffering. So suffering is instrumental in building yourself up, but there is a danger. And if you have too much suffering, then it's like living in the world, like humans living, like living amongst humans as a ghost, which is no good, right? Yeah, and I've heard this criticism before of Christians in general and Kierkegaard's philosophy, that there's like too much focus on, heaven and the afterlife and so forth, and that there's not enough focus on appreciating this world. This is something that sort of like, and this and the double movement kind of like challenges that view, because it's saying there is a purpose of living in this world, and it's not to be super depressed, and it's not to despair, and it's not to give up in a suicide like that. That it's that through that double movement, it's that resignation, which indeed, if you just have that single movement, you have the resignation, and then sure, at that point you should say, why don't I just commit suicide and go to heaven, or why don't I just end it? Why don't I just focus entirely on God and entirely on heaven? And that's indeed what monks do, right? That's his critique of the monks in this view, that they have that single movement. But the problem is that they alienate themselves from society, right? They don't have that. There's two commandments: love God, love your neighbor, and you're alienating that first one. So you don't want to live amongst humans as a ghost too, because there's too much suffering in your life. That's no good. You're missing out on this life, and that's no good. Page 114. If love can be preserved in marriage, then so can the aesthetic. So arguing that the aesthetic life, what A loves so much, is still persisting into the ethical life. It's just been transformed, but it's kind of like dethroned, he says, in another sense. But it still exists. This aesthetic still exists, and maybe we can't portray it in art as well. Remember, author A is describing Mozart's Don Giovanni, how great this is. Like, okay, maybe it's true that the first love and romantic love is better portrayed in art. That doesn't mean it's better aesthetically in general. He's actually saying, no, marriage preserves that, and it's actually better. That aesthetic is better in marriage. A very Kierkegaardian thing on page 118. I won't go too much into it, but result of going forwards is sometimes going backwards. Page 125 to 126. The married man doesn't kill time, but time is rescued and it's preserved in eternity. This sense of taking care of time, and time is a topic that keeps coming up. Page 129, the healthy individual lives simultaneously in hope and in recollection. Again, it's time again, right? Hoping for the future, towards the future. Recollection, looking to the past, being a little bit nostalgic about the past. Page 133, I double starred this, so it must be important. Let me start again. If you cannot manage to see the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious as three great allies, without this unity, then life is meaningless. So it's important that these are allies, right? These aren't something that, like, the aesthetic, when you move to the ethical, the aesthetic disappears. It's still a part of the ethical life, and indeed the religious life too. They're all connected, and they're kind of, one doesn't disappear when you go into the other realm. And I think it's more, it's a misunderstanding of these spheres and these stages, I think. But I think we're going to hear more about this in Stages on Life's Way, which is kind of thought of as the sequel to Either Or. But these three realms, these are very Kierkegaardian, so get used to them. We'll hear more about it. Page 153. Um, this reminded me of a quote from Thoreau. Many live lives in a quiet lostness. Thoreau says something similar. Many men live lives of quiet desperation. Famous quote. I should have looked it up, but I'm not sure which one came first. But it sounds very much like that. Page 171. The sickness of our time. It's not willing. It is not willing deeply and inwardly. It's the mother of all sins. So it's not looking inwardly and deeply. It's just distracting ourselves with the busyness. I'm taking that to mean that. On page 175, all aesthetic life views are despair. That's the life of the A is living, the aesthetic life, and this is the life that's only leading to despair. Page 185, he's like holding off giving birth to himself. What? Oh, okay, this is like shocking language. What does this mean? You're giving off. You're holding off giving birth to yourself. So he explained this in another part of the book where what this means is you have your actual self, which is yourself as is, right? That's who you are. That's who I am right now. Our actual selves, and then we have an idea of our ideal selves. Who do we want to be? Hopefully we want to be someone better, and we're trying to work towards that. And indeed, author B is saying that is your life's task, actually, to act on that, and your task is to work on yourself. But author A is holding off on that. He's not acting, right? He's like holding off giving birth to himself. Pretty dramatic language. I thought this was interesting too. On page 191, there's an idea of the importance of the universality of despair. That some people can be clever in the world and doubt. Those are the people who go into science and philosophy, and they have clever minds, right? They can doubt, and those are clever people. That's not accessible to everyone, right? But in a similar way that I feel like the Bible and that Christianity should be accessible and is accessible to everyone. Everyone is able to despair, Kierkegaard says, or actually author A or author B says this. All are able to despair. It's universally able. Even for lack of a better word, that even the dumbest person is able to despair, and that helps build them up and actually works on their own life project. They don't need to be clever. They can still have their own life task that applies to them. They could work on themselves, and they don't need to be clever at that. But the start that's required for that, the foundation for that is the despair and realizing that they're not who they want to be. Let me zoom forward here. At page 197, another way to describe it, it's like gaining yourself. Another way of describing that, giving birth to yourself. Despairing, when you're despairing, and then improving, you're gaining yourself. And you're awakening, page 207. That is very like Buddhist-like language again. The individual's awakening. Page 208. Kind of a bummer. Sorrow is the real meaning of life. And remember, there was a section in the first book of Either Or about the unhappiest one. A little bit of a sarcastic entry, if you remember right. And he's talking about who is the unhappiest one. And author B is saying the unhappiest one is actually the one in supreme happiness, kind of like turning it on its head a little bit. Kind of a difficult one to agree with, but it's when you read it, it's somewhat more convincing than I'm explaining it here. So read it for yourself. But there's something that comes out of being unhappy that you eventually hit that rock bottom, and I think you grow from that, and it becomes a supreme happiness through that sorrow. If you could reach that point. Page 230, the ethical has the task as oneself. I think I mentioned that already. That is your life task, to work on yourself. And that's accessible to everyone, right? You don't have to be clever to work on yourself, right? Not everyone needs to be a superhero or a hero, right? This is accessible. This is universally accessible. This is a great description of, I think. Let me read this, and I'll try to explain it the best I can. Making duty internal, page 237. As a particular individual, I am not the universal, and to require it of me is unreasonable. Consequently, if I am to be capable of performing the universal, I must be the universal at the same time as I am the particular, but then the dialectic of duty resides within me. This is talking about duty and the universal and the particular and all of this, basically saying that this thing must not be so abstract and so outside of me. And if this is required of me, this duty is required of me, I need to internalize it somehow and make it part of my own particular being. So it must be kind of internalized. And this is what really Kierkegaard means with in a journal entry, I must find a truth that is true for me. He's not saying there is no objective reality out there. He's saying in order to build myself up, in order for it to be upbuilding, it needs to be internalized in me. It has to resonate in a particular aspect of me. Yes, there is a universal out there, universal truth and objective truth, but it's like no good at all if I can do nothing with that. I need to take that, and what am I supposed to do with this, right? That's kind of like asking that question to it. I need to what's another way of saying it? Sometimes it's used in a bad way, but it's it's really, what's the word? Anyway, I can't think of the exact word. Appropriation. I'm sorry. Usually we think of appropriation in a negative term these ways, but it's really appropriating that objective truth for yourself. And we need to do that in a way to make that universal goal the more particular, if that makes sense. Hopefully some of these words make sense to you. I'm hoping. On page 242, you cannot become ethically conscious without becoming aware of your eternal being. Page 265, the most talented person can become complete in his task, and so can the humblest of men. It's universally available to all. Everyone can work on their life's task. And then talking about in 267, the hero and then the ordinary person, right? A is thinking the hero has to do something extraordinary. B is saying, no, actually the hero is the one who does the ordinary thing in everyday life. The hero is the one who has that ordinary humdrum marriage or whatever, and they live through it, and they show up every day, and they go to work, and they do their task every day, and they're acting, right? It's that the hero is the ordinary person, not the extraordinary person, kind of turning it on its head. Page 294, the genuinely extraordinary person is the genuinely ordinary person, reinforcing that. And he doesn't mention it, but I'm really thinking of, Jesus' words, like the first will be last and the last will be first, right? It's really flipping it on its head. And closing it off here on page 316, only in an infinite relationship with God could the doubt be calmed. Only in an infinitely free relationship with God could his cares be turned to joy. He is in an infinite relationship with God when he acts, when he acknowledges that God is always right. He is in infinitely free relationship with God when he acknowledges that he is always wrong. This is a little bitter pill to swallow, but there's a little talk at the end about you're basically acknowledging that you're always wrong and God's always in the right, and that's how God is different, right? But there's a negative way to think about that, but we should not think about that. We should think about this in a positive way and acknowledge we're always wrong and be comfortable with that. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but he might make a better argument if you read that for yourself. And at the very end, going back to that appropriation of the truth type thing, he ends it, the very last sentence here on page 318. Only the truth that builds up is truth for you. It does not mean truth is relative. It means the truth that you can do something with, that you can work on your life's task with, the truth that upbuilds you, truth that transforms your life, that gives you your life view, that gives you meaning. That is the truth for you. And you have to appropriate that and internalize that, and it's something that happens inside, and it's not accidental like it is in B's life, or A's life rather, but B, It's an intentional choice. It's acting, it's choosing, it's making that choice your own. It might be something that starts off as accidental, but you dignify it by saying, I'm taking ownership of it and this is my thing now, and you're being more intentional about that. That's what B is saying. That's what life is about. um, so I hope some of this helped. I'm just gonna end with Kierkegaardian themes that are gonna persist. We already talked about the double movement, about time, suffering, duty, about action and tasks, and giving birth to yourself, and metamorphosizing from the ethical or the aesthetic sphere into the ethical sphere, and then later on it's gonna be metamorphosizing again into the more religious and in later Kierkegaard's writings. But it's a metamorphosis that kind of preserves the other spheres in a way. It's interesting stuff. I have to say I did appreciate this book a lot more than the first one, and that surprised me. And it might be because where I'm at in life, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure only a few years ago I read this for the first time actually. Um, both parts, and this one I kind of skipped through to the end and it was not resonating with me. This time it was different and I appreciated it and I got it, and I was seeing the case to be made. Um, and I think it's good stuff, and it's all stuff that's going to be reiterated throughout Kierkegaard's authorship. So I think the more we read about it, the more we can learn about this, and it all comes together at the end of what he calls his first authorship, which ends with the concluding unscientific postscript, which is a more direct way of saying what he's trying to get at in all these works. But it is fun to go along for the ride. And this indeed was his most famous work, I believe. That Either Or, definitely the most controversial, with that Seducer's Diary, which was exciting in the first book. But now, it's the case for marriage and marriage life. And, the idea that even for the person who's not married, I think, I'm always thinking from my perspective, like, you still have your life tasks, and that is your task. That's your duty in life, right? Just as like when you were a kid, you had your task of doing your homework. That's what author B says. Now you're working on yourself, and you have your grown up life tasks, and you're working on yourself, and you're transforming yourself, and you're giving birth to yourself. It's interesting language here. So it's good stuff. So I apologize, this went on very long. I try to condense a lot down from this one book into one video. I appreciate you sticking with me if you made it to the end. But yeah, join me next time, and we'll continue our Kierkegaard journey. So thanks for joining me again. I'll see you next time.